In April of 1925, while Europe was still struggling to rise from the ruins of the Great War, a boy named Shlomo Perel was born in Peine, Germany. His Jewish family led a modest and quiet life, never imagining that in just a few years, the rise of the Third Reich would threaten not only their future, but their very existence. Expelled from school due to racial laws, his childhood was abruptly interrupted with the Nazis' rise to power. Amid this persecution, Shlomo made a decision that would shape his destiny: to hide his identity and adopt a new name, Yosef Perel. With this disguise, he managed to infiltrate the very structures of the regime, first in the Wehrmacht and later in the Hitler Youth. In both settings, he lived under constant pressure, forced to maintain a role where a single misstep could mean death. His journey is not only a feat of survival, but also a reflection of the darkest contradictions in European history. His voice and memory preserve episodes that reveal how cunning and determination could defy fate in times of extermination. This documentary explores the life of Solomon Perel, the Jewish boy who, disguised as a Nazi, managed to survive within the very machinery that sought to destroy him. The difficult adaptation of a German boy in Jewish Poland. In April of 1925, while the Weimar Republic was experiencing one of its most hopeful periods, Solomon Perel was born in Peine, a modest town in Lower Saxony. His parents, Azriel and Rebecca, had fled from Russia, escaping the brutal Tsarist pogroms, bringing with them only the determination to rebuild their lives. Like many Eastern European Jewish families, they found in a small shoe store the economic foundation that allowed them to settle and gain some respect in the local community. Solomon's early years passed in relative normalcy, though not without tensions. The family faced disdain from some established German Jews who considered Eastern immigrants less refined. This internal discrimination foreshadowed the far more brutal divisions to come. Despite these challenges, the Perels gradually integrated into Peine's social life. Azriel worked tirelessly while Rebecca cared for their 4 children, Bertha, Isaac, David, and young Solomon. To any observer, they represented the model of a Jewish family that had found its place in modern Germany. However, everything began to crumble in 1933 when Adolf Hitler rose to power. Azriel Perel, like many contemporaries, initially maintained a degree of optimism, convinced that this madman would not remain in power for more than 80 days. This perception, shared by many German Jews, would prove to be a fatal underestimation of the Nazi regime's destructive capacity. Anti-Jewish measures gradually transformed the family's daily life. Boycotts of Jewish businesses drastically reduced the shoe store's income, while the social atmosphere grew increasingly hostile. Neighbors who once maintained cordial relations turned cold, if not openly antagonistic. The official codification of Jewish exclusion came with the Nuremberg laws in 1935. When Solomon directly experienced the system's brutality, he was expelled from school at the age of 10. This humiliation was not merely symbolic. It represented the complete denial of any future in Germany for Solomon and his siblings. Their parents realized that staying would condemn their children to a marginalized existence, with no opportunities for education, work, or social integration. Faced with this harsh reality, they made the most difficult decision for any parent: to abandon everything they had built over the years. Poland, with its large Jewish population, seemed to offer a safe refuge. Their arrival in Lodz in 1935 marked the beginning of unexpected challenges. Solomon, accustomed to life in a small German town, found himself immersed in an industrial metropolis with a vibrant Jewish community, where cultural differences were immediately apparent. Local Jewish children did not warmly welcome this German-speaking refugee who seemed out of place in their world. The initial adaptation was particularly arduous. The taunts of his new peers, who perceived him as strange, complicated his integration. Additionally, he had to master Polish. However, youth worked in his favor. Over time, he not only learned the language but also developed a genuine affection for his new homeland. Poland began to feel like a true home. During these years in Lodz, Solomon completed his primary education and formed meaningful friendships with peers like Jerzy Rapoport and Jakub Lublinski. Together, they shared studies and discussions about politics and the uncertain future looming over Europe. These relationships, forged in a period of relative normalcy, would prove invaluable when the world around them collapsed. In parallel, Solomon became involved in youth organizations. His participation in the Gordonia Club introduced him to the anthem Hatikva, which years later would provide solace in desperate moments. He also joined the Komsomol, the communist youth organization, reflecting the ideological sympathies many young Jews developed in the face of rising European fascism. This newfound stability lasted barely 4 years. On September 1st, 1939, German troops crossed the Polish border, starting the Second World War. For Solomon and his family, this marked the materialization of their worst fears. The regime they had fled was now pursuing them to their refuge. The bombings of Lodz began immediately. The city that had represented hope and safety suddenly transformed into a scene of terror. Jewish families who had rebuilt their lives after years of effort saw everything collapse once again. The prospect of confinement in a ghetto became an imminent reality. Faced with this new catastrophe, Rebecca and Azriel Perel made a desperate decision. They knew that staying in occupied territory meant certain doom, and with heavy hearts, they urged their younger children to flee eastward. Isaac and Solomon set out with their parents' blessing and a mandate that became their reason for living. They had to survive at all costs. During that farewell, their mother etched a clear exhortation into Solomon's memory. They had brought him into the world to live, not to give up. The flight to Soviet territory turned into an odyssey fraught with dangers. The brothers joined thousands of refugees escaping the German advance. The journey included moments of extreme tension, such as crossing the Bug River in precarious conditions, where Solomon nearly drowned when an overloaded boat capsized, only to be rescued by a Soviet soldier. The brothers finally reached Białystok, a city in northeastern Poland that, after the invasion, had come under Soviet control. They believed they had found a respite, but the relief was short-lived. The authorities decided to separate them and sent Solomon to a state orphanage in Grodno, a city near the Lithuanian border where a communist education system operated. In that environment, marked by official atheism and class struggle, he at least found physical safety and the opportunity to continue his studies. At the orphanage, Solomon adapted quickly. His prior involvement with the Komsomol opened doors, and he soon stood out as a student committed to Soviet ideals. During this period, he even distanced himself from his religious roots, which he considered incompatible with the new political worldview surrounding him. Capture and metamorphosis, from Jew to Hitler Youth. June 22, 1941, marked a definitive turning point in European history and, unbeknownst to him, in Solomon Perel's personal destiny. When German divisions crossed the Soviet border, launching Operation Barbarossa, millions of civilians were swept up in a wave of violence that would forever reshape the continent's map. Among those desperate refugees, a 16-year-old teenager was about to undergo one of the most extraordinary transformations of humanity's darkest period. Solomon was then in Soviet territory, having lost contact with his brother Isaac during the chaotic evacuation of the Grodno orphanage. German troops were advancing with a speed that caught even the Soviet high command off guard. Thousands of civilians, primarily Jews who had sought refuge in the eastern zone, found themselves trapped with no possibility of escape. During his desperate flight deeper into Russia, Solomon joined a crowd of refugees moving along congested roads under fire from German aviation. His clothes were in tatters after days of crawling through bushes and rocky terrain. Hunger progressively weakened him, and his appearance was that of any other refugee, dirty, exhausted, and terrified. It was in this context of absolute chaos that an encounter occurred that would radically change his existence. A patrol of German soldiers intercepted the group of fugitives Solomon had joined. For the military, these civilians were a nuisance to be eliminated quickly. Under normal circumstances, the procedure was straightforward. Jews were summarily executed, while others could be used as labor or simply released. Solomon instantly understood that he was facing the most decisive moment of his life. In a matter of minutes, perhaps seconds, he would be questioned about his identity. His response would determine whether he would continue living or become another statistic of the Nazi genocide. With extraordinary presence of mind for someone his age, he made a decision that defied all logic. Instead of trying to hide his origins, he would invent an entirely new identity. When a German soldier asked who he was, Solomon responded with a lie crafted with superhuman speed. He presented himself as a Volksdeutscher, an ethnic German who had lived in Soviet territory and was now trying to return to his homeland. He explained that he had been separated from his family during the confusion of the war's early days and, as a good German patriot, sought to join the Reich's forces. The audacity of this strategy was extraordinary. Rather than minimizing his presence or trying to go unnoticed, Solomon chose to actively present himself as someone valuable to his captors. Moreover, he did so in perfect German, without a foreign accent, which immediately caught the soldiers' attention. His physical appearance, with blonde hair and features that perfectly matched Nazi racial stereotypes, supported his improvised story. The soldier questioning him initially showed distrust, but gradually began to believe the story's plausibility. Other patrol members approached, intrigued by finding an alleged compatriot in such extraordinary circumstances. Far from being executed, Solomon found himself being treated with unexpected courtesy. They offered him food, water, and most importantly, protection under German military custody. In the days that followed, as he was transferred between different military units, he perfected his new persona. He adopted the name Joseph Perel, an alias he created by combining elements that sounded convincingly German. His integration was facilitated by his linguistic skills and apparent enthusiasm for collaborating with his saviors. He was quickly assigned as an interpreter, a role he performed with remarkable efficiency. His knowledge of Russian, Polish, and German made him a valuable asset for the units operating in occupied territory. At the same time, he observed every behavior and gesture of his comrades to refine his impersonation. During this period of adaptation, Solomon experienced a profound psychological conflict. On one hand, he felt relieved to have escaped certain death and grateful for the relatively cordial treatment he received. At the same time, the awareness that he was collaborating with those who systematically persecuted his people generated overwhelming guilt. A particularly revealing anecdote from this period involves his relationship with Heinz, the company doctor. During a routine medical examination, Heinz discovered physical evidence that revealed Solomon's Jewish origin. Instead of reporting him, the doctor chose to protect him, establishing a silent complicity that provided the young refugee with a crucial ally in his dangerous environment. This episode demonstrated that even within the Nazi military machinery, there were individuals capable of acts of humanity. Solomon's stay with the military units lasted several months. During this time, he participated in operations as an interpreter and became the company's mascot due to his apparent youth and enthusiasm. However, any investigation into his past would have resulted in his immediate execution. The next chapter of his extraordinary odyssey began when the military authorities decided that such a promising young German should not remain exposed to the dangers of the front. It was determined that Joseph Perel would be sent back to the Reich to complete his education and training as a future leader of the new European order. The journey to Germany took place in the company of a Hitler Youth officer who had been assigned to escort him. During the trip, Solomon had to invent convincing details about his supposed military experience. Arriving in the capital of the Reich represented a moment of emotional vertigo for Solomon. Berlin, the city from which the persecution of his family and the destruction of his previous world had been orchestrated, now welcomed him as a potential hero. The streets where the SA had marched during the 1930s, the same streets he had seen in newsreels while living in Poland, were now the ones he walked dressed in a Nazi uniform, greeted and respected as an exemplary citizen of the Third Reich. His final destination was the Hitler Youth School in Braunschweig, an elite institution designed to train the future leaders of the Nazi Party. The contrast with his situation only months earlier could not have been more dramatic. The Jewish refugee who had fled the Łódź ghetto was now entering one of the most prestigious educational institutions of the regime that had destroyed his former life. Adapting to the Hitler Youth environment required Solomon to develop new facets of his fictitious personality. Josef Perel had to demonstrate not only loyalty to the Reich, but also academic and physical excellence. The days were structured with military discipline, combining traditional education, intensive physical training, and systematic ideological indoctrination. The racial theory classes represented the most disturbing challenge for Solomon. He had to study and pretend to believe in the pseudo-sciences that justified the persecution of his own people. In an extraordinary irony, the instructors classified him as a perfect example of the Eastern Baltic race, praising his physical features as representative of Aryan purity. Everyday life at the boarding school meant living 24 hours a day with genuine Nazi youths, many of whom had been fanatical since childhood. Every moment demanded constant performance. His gradual integration was facilitated by his intellectual ability. The program included work in local factories and public ceremonies, where he marched in uniform before party authorities, becoming a living symbol of Nazi educational success. This complete transformation from Jewish refugee to model student of the Reich represented a survival feat that defied all odds. Solomon had managed not only to escape immediate death, but also to integrate fully into the power structure that had caused the destruction of his former world. However, this successful integration also raised moral and psychological dilemmas that would accompany him for the rest of his clandestine existence. While consolidating his new outward identity, Solomon secretly maintained hope of reuniting with his family. The news filtering in about the situation in occupied Poland was increasingly alarming, but he preserved the belief that his parents and siblings had somehow survived. This hope would become the emotional driving force that pushed him to take extraordinary risks in the months to come. Every dawn in Braunschweig, the silent battle to exist. The months following Solomon Perel's admission to the Hitler Youth School in Braunschweig developed a routine that dangerously oscillated between apparent normality and constant terror. Each morning when the bugle sound awakened the inmates at 5:30, Josef Perel opened his eyes facing the same terrifying question. Would this be the day his deception was discovered? The daily structure followed strict military patterns that allowed no deviation. After the mandatory wake-up, the youths went to the yard for morning physical exercise, combining calisthenics, running, and basic weapons training. Solomon had discovered that excelling in these activities not only maintained his façade, but also provided a way to channel the anxiety consuming him. During these sessions, he carefully observed his peers, studying gestures, expressions, and reactions. He learned to reproduce the iron determination expected of a future Nazi leader, to modulate his voice to reflect ideological conviction, and to maintain a posture that conveyed racial confidence. Every detail of his behavior had been consciously constructed to reinforce his fictitious identity. The communal showers after exercise invariably represented the most dangerous moment of each day. The circumcision he bore as an indelible physical mark of his Jewish origin constituted a mortal threat that hung over him like the sword of Damocles. In a society where this practice was associated exclusively with Jewish identity, being discovered would mean not only immediate death but also prior torture. To avoid exposure, Solomon had developed elaborate strategies which he executed with military precision. He arrived early to secure a spot in the corners where he could better control the angles of observation. He always kept a towel strategically positioned and had learned to shower in a way that minimized any possibility of being seen. When other boys came too close, he created conversational distractions or withdrew with excuses about the cold water. The tension was so intense that Solomon even considered self-mutilation to explain his different physical condition, although he ultimately abandoned the idea due to the risks involved. Ideological indoctrination constituted another central element that subjected Solomon to constant psychological torment. The racial theory classes, taught with the solemnity of irrefutable scientific dogmas, forced him to listen for long hours to pseudo-academic justifications for the extermination of his own people. The instructors described in detail the supposed physical and mental characteristics that made Jews inferior and dangerous, using diagrams, photographs, and cranial measurements. These sessions demanded not only maintaining an expression of respectful attention, but also actively participating in discussions that required enthusiasm for the Reich's anti-Jewish policies. He learned to modulate his voice to convey the appropriate disgust when Jews were mentioned, to nod at the correct moments, and to pose questions that demonstrated ideological commitment. In a particularly cruel irony, his instructors frequently used him as a physical example of Aryan racial purity, praising precisely those features that had made his survival possible. Lessons on racial identification became especially disturbing exercises in which Solomon had to learn to recognize Jewish traits in photographs and drawings. His ability to pass these exams with outstanding grades only reinforced his superiors' admiration for his supposed natural racial intuition. The military component of the program included weapons training, basic combat tactics, and preparation for future service in the Reich's armed forces. Each military skill he acquired represented an additional contradiction. He was being trained to fight against the forces that could potentially liberate his family and his people. Afternoons were typically devoted to work in local factories, mainly at Volkswagen facilities, where Solomon participated in the production of military vehicles. During these periods, he experienced moments of emotional connection when he managed to exchange furtive glances with workers who were clearly suffering under the Nazi yoke. Occasionally, he succeeded in slipping small portions of food or cigarettes to Soviet prisoners, acts of minimal solidarity that allowed him to preserve a vestige of humanity. The most complex aspect of his daily survival lay in the interpersonal relationships he had to cultivate with his classmates. Solomon quickly understood that social isolation would be suspicious in an environment designed to foster male camaraderie. He needed to establish genuine friendships that protected him from suspicion, but without ever allowing intimacy that could reveal his secrets. With Gerhard, a boy supposedly from Peine like himself, Solomon had to maintain a particularly delicate balance. When Gerhard casually mentioned their shared hometown, Solomon experienced a moment of absolute panic before convincingly feigning ignorance about local details that could have betrayed him. He developed the skill of diverting potentially dangerous conversations to safer topics, using questions about others' experiences to avoid elaborating on his own. Dormitory nights reached a critical point of vulnerability. Conversations among boys could drift into dangerous territory. Solomon learned to play the role of attentive listener rather than narrator of personal experiences, showing admiration for others' stories while offering vague and non-committal versions of his own past. With weekends and holidays came additional challenges. While many classmates returned to their families, Solomon had to invent convincing explanations for why he could not visit relatives or receive correspondence. The absence of letters or packages would have aroused suspicion, so he concocted stories about family members in military service and interrupted communications. On certain occasions, he even wrote letters to himself in different handwriting to simulate correspondence. Meanwhile, Nazi celebrations became tests of psychological endurance. During party anniversaries, military commemorations, or oath ceremonies, Solomon was required to participate enthusiastically in rituals that exalted the destruction of his own world. With rehearsed precision, he synchronized his Sieg Heil shouts with those of his classmates, sang hymns with the required intensity, and modulated his expression to display the appropriate exaltation during official speeches. One of the most traumatic episodes occurred during a screening of anti-Semitic propaganda films. In the crowded theater, Solomon was forced not only to witness dehumanizing representations of his people, but also to join in the laughter and jeers of the others. Maintaining composure amidst that spectacle required a mental dissociation that left permanent scars on his psyche. Yet, amid so much hostility, flashes of unexpected humanity appeared. Miss Kirchie, an administrative officer, showed him maternal kindness that went beyond her duties. Even more significant was the bond with Otto Zaglauer, a classmate with whom he shared chess games and literary conversations. Otto represented the young German who, under other circumstances, would have been a natural friend, thoughtful, curious, and less fanatical than most. The contradictions intensified when romantic feelings arose toward Leni, a young woman connected to the school. That attraction, laden with emotional complexity, forced him to confront questions about identity and the future that were beyond his capacity to resolve. His encounters with Leni moved within strict boundaries, designed to express affection without compromising the secret that kept him alive. The pressure of maintaining so many masks simultaneously soon manifested physically. Chronic insomnia, loss of appetite, and anxiety attacks threatened to expose him. To cope, he created mental relaxation routines. He silently recited Hebrew prayers and evoked songs his mother had sung to him in childhood, serving as anchors of sanity and memory. At the same time, something unsettling began to happen. Certain aspects of Nazi life were starting to feel familiar. Military discipline, organizational efficiency, and male camaraderie offered satisfactions that complicated his self-image. In that ambiguity, the line between necessary performance and real adaptation grew increasingly blurred. Intermittently, news from the war provided fragments of information about the fate of his people. Reports of resettlements, expanding ghettos, and cleansing operations painted a grim horizon. Amid despair and grief, Solomon also found renewed determination to survive in order to honor the memory of those absent. His evolving life at the school thus became an extreme example of the human capacity for adaptation. Each day demanded new skills, accurately reading expressions hinting at suspicion, skillfully diverting dangerous conversations, and demonstrating Nazi fervor without compromising the essence of his identity. This double existence, pushed to the limits of possibility, was about to face its greatest challenge. Solomon was preparing for the most daring decision of his odyssey, attempting to visit his parents in the Łódź ghetto, using as his safe passage the very Nazi identity that kept him alive. Confusion of identities amid the collapse of the Third Reich. The year 1945 dawned over a Germany beginning to crumble from its foundations. Solomon Perel, who had survived for years as Joseph Perel at the very heart of the Nazi educational system, faced the culmination of the most extraordinary psychological endurance test in modern history. The Reich that had shaped his fictitious identity was beginning to falter, though this offered no guarantee of immediate safety. The news filtering into the Braunschweig school during the winter of 1944 to 1945 painted a bleak picture for the German forces. The Western and Eastern fronts were inexorably approaching German territory, while Allied bombings intensified pressure on the Reich's industrial cities. The instructors officially presented these setbacks as temporary, claiming that the German military genius would reverse them through secret weapons and revolutionary tactics. Solomon observed with a complex mix of hope and terror. The Allied advance represented the possibility of liberation and the end of his clandestine existence, though he understood that the final moments of the Nazi regime could be the most dangerous. The desperation of collapse could trigger stricter investigations, internal purges, or the violent chaos typical of falling totalitarian systems. These final months allowed him to perfect his survival strategies, turning them into subtle art. He had learned to read institutional tensions with the precision of a human seismograph, detecting environmental changes that signaled imminent danger. When some instructors displayed nervousness or certain classmates disappeared without explanation, Solomon adjusted his behavior to remain within a protective zone of invisibility. Official propaganda maintained a forced optimism that contrasted dramatically with the reality of German deterioration. Speeches about ultimate victory grew strident as food supplies dwindled, basic provisions vanished, and bombings approached dangerously. Solomon participated in the required demonstrations of faith, shouting slogans about resistance to the death, while internally counting the days until his possible liberation. His closest brush with exposure occurred when he received a police summons for a routine investigation regarding ancestral documentation. Authorities had begun a systematic review of student records, searching for inconsistencies that might indicate enemy infiltration or identity forgery. Solomon went to the police station, aware that his fabricated story would face the most rigorous scrutiny yet. The interrogation required him to maintain outward composure while answering detailed questions about his supposed Baltic origin and the circumstances of his arrival in the Reich. The officers expressed suspicion over narrative gaps, requesting documentation he knew was impossible to provide. The deadline of several days to present the required certificates confronted him with the gravest crisis of his entire imposture. Salvation came from an unexpected source. A formation of Allied bombers attacked Braunschweig with unprecedented intensity on the night of the deadline. Explosions lit the night sky as Solomon remained sheltered in the school's basements, experiencing contradictory emotions at the destruction he witnessed. At dawn, he emerged to discover that the police station building had been completely destroyed, taking with it all the files that could have revealed his true identity. This bombing represented an extraordinary moment of psychological liberation. For the first time in years, he was able to silently send a prayer of gratitude to anonymous pilots who, unknowingly, had eliminated the most immediate threat to his survival. The irony was not lost on him. The forces fighting to liberate his people had just specifically saved his individual life. The destroyed files, disrupted communications and scattered personnel created bureaucratic chaos that made any further investigation into his origin impossible. Joseph Perel had acquired by a wartime accident a documentary legitimacy that even the most careful planning could not have achieved. However, this temporary relief brought new practical challenges as the educational infrastructure in Braunschweig disintegrated under the pressure of continuous bombings. Classes were constantly interrupted, instructors disappeared without notice, and many students were evacuated or called for civil defense duties. Solomon navigated these changes by remaining useful but not indispensable, visible but not memorable. He experienced a strange sense of normalization of his false identity. After years of playing Joseph Perel, certain aspects of this persona had begun to feel natural. Military discipline, institutional routines, and even elements of Nazi camaraderie provided familiar structures that complicated his self-image. His 20th birthday on April 21, 1945, marked a moment of deep reflection on the years that had passed since his initial capture by German soldiers. 4 years of dual existence had developed acting skills and psychological resilience that would permanently shape his character. Contemplating this personal anniversary, Solomon could not know that he was only weeks away from the end of his clandestine odyssey. The first Allied soldiers to arrive in Braunschweig were not the expected American troops, but advance units that created confusion regarding procedures. Hitler Youth students found themselves in an ambiguous situation. Technically enemy combatants, yet also minor civilians whose legal status was uncertain under international conventions. The post-occupation chaos posed the complex challenge of revealing his true identity without compromising personal safety. The liberating soldiers, though well-intentioned, could not immediately distinguish between genuine Nazis and hidden victims. His Hitler Youth uniform and German documentation automatically classified him as a potential enemy, regardless of his actual origin. Unmasking required careful planning that reversed years of concealment. Solomon had to prove his Jewish identity to authorities who had reason to distrust claims made by young Germans desperate to avoid consequences. His knowledge of Hebrew, detailed memories of pre-war Jewish life, and ability to describe specific Holocaust experiences gradually convinced Allied intelligence officers of the truth of his extraordinary story. Official confirmation triggered an emotional crisis that had been deferred for years. For the first time since 1941, he could openly acknowledge his real name, family origin, and membership in the people he had survived by hiding. This psychological release was accompanied by deep disorientation. After years of performing a role, reclaiming his authentic identity required a complex process of readjustment. Repatriation camps connected him with other Jewish survivors who had used different strategies to survive the Holocaust. These encounters provided perspective on his own experience, revealing that his method of survival, although extraordinary, was part of a broader spectrum of Jewish resistance and adaptation during Nazi persecution. Fragmentary information about his family's fate arrived through Red Cross records, survivor testimonies, and victim lists. Confirmation that his parents had perished transformed his personal survival from an individual triumph into a memorial responsibility toward the dead. Among the tragic news, rays of hope also emerged. His brother Isaac had survived and was attempting to emigrate to Palestine. The reunion with Isaac at a refugee camp represented both emotional closure and an opening toward the future. The brothers had survived using completely different strategies. Isaac through armed resistance and clandestine life in the forests, Solomon through infiltration into the enemy system. Their divergent experiences reflected the diversity of Jewish responses to systematic persecution. Their conversations revealed both shared scars and fundamental differences created by separate experiences. Isaac had preserved his Jewish identity intact through continuous struggle against persecutors, while Solomon had preserved his physical life through temporary denial of that same identity. Both methods had required different forms of heroism and left distinct psychological marks. The joint decision to emigrate to Palestine represented both escape from a devastated Europe and an active commitment to building an independent Jewish homeland. Solomon saw this choice as an opportunity to finally integrate fragmented identities in a context where being Jewish required neither concealment nor apology. The journey to Palestine through clandestine networks that helped Jewish refugees bypass British immigration restrictions provided additional time to process the existential transformation. The weeks of travel allowed reflection on the years that had passed and the beginning of mentally articulating the survival narrative he would eventually share with the world. The port of Haifa marked the definitive end of his identity as Joseph Perel and the complete rebirth of Solomon Perel. For the first time in years, he could use his real name without fear, speak Hebrew openly, and belong to a community that celebrated rather than concealed his Jewish identity. This transition, while liberating, presented challenges of integration in a society where his unique experience as a Nazi infiltrator distinguished him even among Holocaust survivors. The Eichmann trial and the awakening of repressed memories. Solomon Perel's arrival in Jewish Palestinian territory in July 1948 coincided with one of the most decisive moments in modern Jewish history. The young Holocaust survivor who had spent years hiding under a Nazi identity was now stepping onto the soil of the newly proclaimed Jewish nation in the midst of the Independence War. This context was not merely circumstantial, it represented the perfect opportunity for Solomon to channel all the emotional energy accumulated through years of clandestine survival into the active construction of a free Jewish future. His integration into Israeli society began immediately with his enlistment in the Israel Defense Forces, where he participated in combat on the Jerusalem front. For Solomon, bearing arms as a Jewish soldier represented a complete symbolic reversal of his previous experience. After years of pretending loyalty to the army that persecuted his people, he was now openly fighting for Jewish survival and independence. This transformation from hidden victim to declared combatant provided a concrete framework for processing the psychological complexities of his earlier experiences. Military service also offered him the opportunity to form genuine relationships for the first time in nearly a decade. His comrades knew his real name, his personal history, and his commitment to the common cause. This normalization of interpersonal relationships after years of constant performance represented a fundamental, though unconscious, therapeutic process. Solomon could finally experience male camaraderie without fear of exposure, establishing authentic friendships without constantly calculating the risks of revelation. Upon completing his military service, Solomon devoted himself to rebuilding a normal civilian life. In 1959, he married Deborah, a decision that marked his definitive commitment to the future and to normalcy. The wedding ceremony, held according to Jewish tradition, publicly represented everything that had been denied to him during his years of clandestine survival. Having children later consolidated this normalization, providing him the opportunity to openly and proudly transmit Jewish values and traditions. The following decades saw Solomon build a successful business career that allowed him to establish economic security for his family. This material stability, which contrasted dramatically with the existential precariousness of his wartime years, provided the emotional foundation necessary to eventually confront his traumatic past. However, during these early years in Israel, he maintained an almost complete silence regarding his Holocaust experiences. This silence was not unusual among survivors of that generation, who often found their experiences so extraordinary that they were difficult to communicate or comprehend for those who had not lived through them. In Solomon's particular case, the nature of his survival added additional layers of complexity. His method of hiding within the Nazi system raised uncomfortable questions about collaboration, resistance, and the moral limits of survival that he preferred to avoid. Moreover, Israeli society in the 1950s and 60s maintained an ambivalent relationship with Holocaust survivors. While their testimony of persecution validated the need for an independent Jewish state, their survival methods sometimes generated implicit judgments about why they had allowed the genocide to occur instead of resisting heroically. Solomon, aware of these social dynamics, chose to integrate quietly rather than stand out for the uniqueness of his experience. This period of silence extended for more than 3 decades, during which Solomon observed how public perception of the Holocaust gradually evolved. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 marked a crucial moment in Israeli society's willingness to confront the realities of Nazi genocide directly. The public testimonies of survivors during the trial set precedents for individual stories to be heard and valued as essential historical documents. At the same time, the development of academic Holocaust studies and the growing international recognition of its historical significance began to create spaces where complex testimonies like Solomon's could be understood within more sophisticated conceptual frameworks. The understanding that survival of genocide required diverse strategies, some morally ambiguous, gradually expanded among historians and educators. Solomon's decision to break his silence finally came in the mid-1980s, motivated by a combination of personal and historical factors. On a personal level, the emotional maturity acquired through decades of normal life had provided him the perspective necessary to contextualize his youthful experience. Historically, the rise of Holocaust denial created a moral urgency for survivors to document their testimonies before it was too late. In 1985, Solomon published his autobiography under the title Ich war Hitlerjunge Salomon, a detailed account of his survival that did not shy away from the moral complexities of his experience. The book represented a considerable act of intellectual courage as it exposed aspects of his story that could provoke misunderstanding or judgment. By choosing complete honesty over the comfort of silence, Solomon demonstrated a commitment to historical truth that transcended concerns about personal image. Critical reception of the book confirmed both the risks and the benefits of his decision to testify. While some readers expressed admiration for his ingenuity and resilience, others questioned the moral aspects of his survival strategy. These mixed reactions reflected the inherent difficulties in judging decisions made under extreme pressure from the perspective of later normalcy. The book's impact quickly transcended linguistic and geographic boundaries when it was translated into multiple languages. Solomon's story resonated particularly in societies that had experienced their own ideological divisions and survival dilemmas in the 20th century. His testimony provided a unique perspective on how individuals navigate the tension between personal integrity and physical survival under extreme conditions. definitive international recognition came with the cinematic adaptation directed by Agnieszka Holland in 1990. The film Europa brought Solomon's story to a visual medium capable of conveying the emotional complexities of his experience to mass audiences. The film achieved the delicate balance of presenting his story without romanticizing or condemning his decisions, allowing viewers to confront their own reactions to the moral dilemmas depicted. The success of the film, which won the Golden Globe for Best Foreign Language Film in 1991 and received an Academy Award nomination, catapulted Solomon's story to worldwide recognition. This media success transformed his personal testimony into a cultural document that educated new generations about the complexities of the Holocaust beyond simplified narratives of victims and perpetrators. With international fame also came the responsibility of serving as a public educator on the Holocaust. Solomon became a sought-after speaker internationally, addressing audiences in schools, universities, museums, and academic conferences. His ability to articulate the moral complexities of survival set him apart from more traditional testimonies, offering nuanced perspectives that enriched public understanding of the genocide. Over these decades of public testimony, Solomon developed profound philosophical reflections on the broader implications of his experience. He frequently emphasized that his survival had depended as much on chance as on strategy, rejecting any interpretation that presented him as exceptionally heroic. This intellectual humility reflected his understanding that millions of other Jews, equally intelligent and determined, had perished due to less favorable circumstances. His reflections on identity became particularly sophisticated over time. Solomon articulated how his experience had demonstrated both the fluidity and persistence of cultural identity. While he had been able to convincingly adopt German behaviors and attitudes, his core Jewish identity had remained intact throughout the imposture. This experiential duality provided him with unique perspectives on contemporary debates about assimilation, multiculturalism, and cultural preservation. In his public presentations, Solomon frequently addressed questions about the moral limits of survival. He acknowledged that his method had required a form of apparent collaboration with the Nazi system, but argued that this superficial collaboration served the more fundamental objective of preserving Jewish life. His reflections contributed significantly to the academic understanding of the moral gray zones that characterized the Holocaust experience. As Solomon reached advanced age, he became one of the last living direct witnesses to certain aspects of the Holocaust. This generational responsibility weighed heavily on him, especially as other survivors of similar experiences passed away progressively. His longevity made him the custodian of memories that only he could convey with experiential authenticity. The death of Solomon Perel in February 2023, at the age of 97, marked the end of an extraordinary life that had spanned nearly the entire 20th century. His passing was widely reported internationally, recognizing his unique contribution to preserving historical memory and Holocaust education. Solomon's legacy transcends his individual story to become a testament to the human capacity for adaptation, resilience, and moral survival under extreme conditions. His testimony challenges simplistic categorizations of victims and perpetrators, demonstrating that historical reality often presents complexities that resist black and white interpretations. For future generations, Solomon Perel's story serves as a powerful reminder that preserving human dignity sometimes requires decisions that defy conventional moral expectations. His life demonstrated that true resistance against genocidal systems can take unexpected forms, including survival itself as an act of defiance. His insistence on telling his full story, including uncomfortable aspects that others might have preferred to conceal, established a standard of intellectual honesty for historical testimony. By rejecting the temptation to simplify his experience for public consumption, Solomon contributed to a more nuanced and complete understanding of one of humanity's darkest periods.